Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I am here with Ross Douthat. He's a columnist at the New York Times, a host of the new podcast Interesting Times, which I've really been enjoying. I feel like you've had some really interesting, mind-blowing episodes recently. I think it's some really pretty great stuff, so I'd recommend that. You're the author of many books, and most particularly, you're the author of the new book, Believe Why Everyone Should Be Religious, which will be the main thing that we're focusing on today. So, Ross, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm glad you're enjoying the show. Hopefully, we will continue to have interesting guests to entertain you.
It's a great title, by the way. I think that's really clever. So I guess first question for your new book, Believe. Why did you write this book? Who's the target audience? And I guess specifically, why did you write this book now? You've been writing books for a long time. I bet you probably have a dozen other book ideas in your head at any given time. Why this one now? For whom? And what's the purpose?
Yeah, I mean, when you write books, you're always looking to not just have an argument that you think is true or useful or interesting, but one that matches onto the moment in some particular way, right? So, in a certain way, there's nothing in this book. It's a case for religious belief, for taking religion seriously, that I couldn't have written 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But my sense is that we are in this kind of distinctive moment right now in American and Western culture where we've sort of reached the end, at least for the moment, of a long wave of secularization, which has sort of defined American culture over the last 20 years, the decline of religious institutions, the decline of religious identification. That seems to be hitting a limit right now. There is a certain degree of renewed interest in religion and religious ideas. I wouldn't describe it as a revival. I would say it's more that the culture is kind of considering whether to have a revival or not.
Yeah.
There's some evidence, honestly, from Western Europe, especially from England and France, that there is an actual religious revival happening there among Gen Z, especially. But I think in America, it's more we're pausing to reflect on where we are, and we're doing it in a landscape where you have a lot of people who really have no contact at all with the traditional experience of religion, right? Like, the conventional non-believer or disaffected former Christian for a long time was someone who had been raised as a churchgoer or who had gone to Sunday school or who had read some of the Bible. And you just can't take that for granted at all among younger Americans, especially right now. So you have a certain kind of vacuum, but then you also have a kind of interest and openness to religion that's clearly stronger than was the case 20 years ago. And there's a few reasons why that might be. One is just that, the sort of militant secularists, what we called the new atheists not that long ago, made a bunch of, pretty empirical predictions about how the world would look if we became less religious, that it would be more tolerant, less polarized, more scientific, more rational, all of these things. And I think everyone can look around at the current landscape and see that has not been borne out at all. So you've had this kind of falsification of atheist confidence is a real thing. And then there's also just, I think, a genuine interest that is sort of natural to human beings, but can be suppressed if people feel like they're sort of shaking off, the dead hand of a fading religious institution. But it comes back, this impulse to be interested in spiritual matters, interested in spiritual ideas, whatever that might mean. And so the book is trying to write into that moment and offer a kind of, in certain ways, very basic introduction to religion itself. I am a Christian. The book ends with Christian arguments. In certain ways, it is Christian apologetics in a certain kind of disguise. But it's written for someone who, might get something out of it without becoming a Christian, might just be led a little bit deeper into the practice of some traditional religious faith. And I would be okay with that achievement as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems targeted at something like a mere religiosity or a mere theism or perhaps even mere polytheism is suggested as at least an improved step. Why did you sort of aim it at kind of like that specific targeted pitch? You do have your last chapter is much more about Christianity and even Catholicism in particular, but the vast majority of the book is sort of a mere religiosity. Why did you aim for that particular target?
Because I think for a lot of people, that can be a strong foundation for a more serious and intense practice of faith, right? And I want to be clear, everybody is different. There's a lot of different paths to religion, and there's a lot of, a lot of different ways that people can become interested in a faith, can practice a faith, and so on. And I've had people, who've read the book or listened to me talk about it, who said, well, I don't like how you try to, place my religious beliefs on top of a kind of rational intellectual foundation. I appreciate religion because it's an escape from the Western mind's over-reliance on rationality, right? And, and there are going to be people for whom that's true, right? Who want religion to be an escape into mystery, who don't want to be told, here are the 5 scientific and philosophical reasons to believe, and that's fine. But I think there are also a lot of people for whom accepting that there's a rational basis for religious faith is an important part of getting anywhere as a would-be religious practitioner. And this is also true for people who are also part of the audience for the book, right? Obviously, which is people who are already believers. In the end, even if you're making an argument to someone, you sell a lot of books to people who already agree with you. That's how publishing works, right? But so people in that zone, I think can find it helpful to know that, if you have a crisis of faith, or you have some kind of, disillusioning experience with a particular religious tradition, and you end up deconstructing, as, disappointed evangelicals like to say, you still should be able to reach a point that feels solid and start to build back up. And so that's the biggest thing I'm trying to figure out and argue for in the book is, what is that solid position, right? And so in explicitly Christian terms, because I am a Christian, there's a moment in the New Testament in the letter to the Romans where St. Paul is talking to his audience, and he says something to the effect of, look, I'm here to tell you about the revelation of Jesus Christ, which is, the most important thing. It's the breaking in of God into the world. This is what I want to convert you to. But even before this revelation came along, you already had some pretty good reasons to believe in God. This revelation shouldn't be just like dropping on you out of a clear blue sky. It should confirm things that you already sort of knew. I'm putting my own spin a little bit on St. Paul's words, but I think that's a fair encapsulation. So in part, the book is just saying, okay, what is, in a 21st century context, with our current range of scientific knowledge and historical experience, what is that basic reality that St. Paul thinks that, again, even people who haven't become Christian yet should be aware of? And I'm interested in that, and I'm trying to sort of tease out what that looks like.
Sure. I have a friend who's an Episcopal priest who's having his church's small groups read your book and then recommending that they find a friend who might be at sort of that target sweet spot to pass it along to. How would you recommend that churches and Christians use your book?
Well, that's very flattering. Maybe I can be responsible for reviving the Episcopal Church in America as a Catholic. That would be sort of an ironic result. I mean, I think that is a good, in certain ways, it's a good way to think about the kind of dynamic I was just describing, right? Where the book is probably initially likely to be read most by people who are religious, even though it is pitched to people who are not, just because of how book markets work. So if you read it as a religious believer and find it compelling, then treating it as, the thing that you give to the friend, not the random friend, but the friend who seems to be open and interested in these kind of arguments, I think would be a tremendous, so it would be tremendously flattering, I guess, to me if people were doing it. But I did think about this book in that way to some degree, like that it can be, what would you give as a religious person who has a friend or a nephew or a grandchild, right, who sort of lukewarmly religious, going off to college, maybe, you know, has a lot of skeptical questions about religion, is not just going to be convinced by a kind of straightforward reassertion of whatever their Sunday school experience was or whatever encounter they've had with religion. And yeah, the book is trying to be kind of useful for people in that zone, and taking seriously, I think, the reality of religious pluralism as a kind of cultural fact that people experience, right? Like for a long time, anyone writing a book about religion in America or Europe could sort of count on the idea that, you know, if you talked someone into the idea that there might be a God, you were basically talking them into Christianity, because Christianity was, you know, was the dominant religion. It was the offer on the table, right? Once you took one step toward religion, you were going to take the rest towards Christianity pretty naturally. Not always, but in many cases. Now we're in a landscape where, you know, people open the computer, they open their phone, they step out into the world, and every religion that exists on planet Earth is there, available to them, making some kind of pitch, right?
Mm-hmm. And allegedly some religions that don't even exist on planet Earth.
That's right. Yes, religions that represent the star people, and, you know, everything in between. And that, I think, Christians and other religion members of other religion traditions too, that believe themselves to be in possession of a kind of particular and singular truth, need to recognize that, like, you need an account of what all those other religions represent, right? And how to think about them. And it can't be, I think it can't be just as simple as saying, you know, they're all fake and we're real, right? Because this is where the, you know, an atheist argument that I've heard many, many times, right, associated with Christopher Hitchens and others, but it's just sort of circulated, right, is the idea that, like, all religious believers are atheists about every god except their own, right? And so if you take that view, then it's really easy to say, okay, come on, believers, you should just push one step further and become a thoroughgoing atheist. And I don't think that's the right way to think about the religious landscape. I don't consider myself an atheist. I'm certainly not an atheist about, you know, the God who appears in Judaism or Islam. I think that is a version of the same God that Christians worship, refracted through different doctrines and traditions. But I wouldn't even say that I'm an atheist about polytheistic religions either. I think that it has always been part of Christian tradition to believe that there are many different spiritual powers in the world, saints and angels and other powers as well. And recognizing that reality, I think, helps get you to a place where you can say, look, you know, I think every religion is a description of spiritual reality. I think my religion offers the most complete description of spiritual reality, and that's why you should join my religion. But other religions are describing part of the reality too, and that's why there are so many of them. You have a bunch of different cultural and human takes on this larger reality. It's not one true faith and everybody else is just making it all up.
Mm-hmm. You spend a lot of time talking about various arguments from science, specifically about arguments relating to the fine-tuning of the universe and various physical laws and things like that. And sort of a general theme, I'd say, is that the conclusions of the science, especially recently, maybe even more in the last half century or so, have not been leading in the sort of atheistic or naturalistic direction that many of the atheists of old might have expected, but are bringing up challenging philosophical, metaphysical questions in and of themselves. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been part of the religious argument, the argument for taking religion seriously, that the universe has structure and order and mathematical beauty and a whole lot of features that seem to bespeak some kind of mind behind the cosmos, some kind of intentionality and design, right? And Darwinism and the theory of evolution posed a specific challenge to a specific part of that argument, but a lot of that argument remains in terms, you know, the architecture of the universe still bespeaks design, even if you think that once the algorithmic process of evolution gets going, that you don't need someone fiddling with it along the way, right? So that's part of the background. What has changed in the last 50 years, as you suggest, is that the design that we have, the universe that we have, has been revealed to be incredibly precise and unlikely in the way that it yields planets, stars, biological life, and us. First, just in the way that it yields order at all, right? There's a nearly infinite number, apparently, of possible universes where, that sort of expand too rapidly or collapse in on themselves too rapidly to ever generate any order at all. But then even beyond that, the particular kind of order you need to get human beings is essentially requires sort of different constants and different features of physical reality to be set in these zones that are defined by one in a quadrillion, one in a quintillion odds that this is how the universe would appear. And as you said, none of that is what most atheist materialist scientists would have expected. They would have expected to discover that there was something necessary about our universe, that it had to be this way for some reason, not that it could have been tons and tons of different ways, and it just happened to be this way because of what seems to a naive viewer like maybe somebody's choice, right? Maybe somebody put it together. Now, it doesn't prove that somebody put it together, but it does put the atheist and the materialist in a peculiar position, because the kind of move that gets made is to essentially say, well, if the universe seems to be one in a near infinite number of possible universes, then the best explanation for why we have this one is that all the others exist too. And this is how you get ideas about the multiverse, beloved of Marvel comic book movie fans and so on. And I think there are ways in which even the idea of the multiverse doesn't actually get rid of some of the issues of design and order and the mystery therein, right? I think you're essentially trying to kick the God problem up a level, but you haven't done away with it. But just the multiverse itself it's just really different from, Galileo and Copernicus challenging the medieval religious picture of the universe by saying, look, here's a telescope. You can look up and see that the stars and planets are not as you thought. And it's different too from Darwin and evolutionary biologists saying, look, we've dug up these fossils and, we have this evidence in, inside biological life and in the fossil record that suggests this common descent. And you can look at it, you can see it. The multiverse says, it appears to you that the universe was made by the hand of a creator, but have you considered that there may be an infinite number of universes that you can't see and will never be able to see, but just have to accept, not on faith, but on intellectual speculation, as an alternative to the idea that mind and intentionality is behind this? Even if you think it's true, you have to acknowledge that you've retreated from empiricism to your own form of metaphysical speculation. And I think that's a big change, and that people who are sort of dimly familiar with these debates should be aware of, that part of the materialist case just looks quite different and quite weaker than it did 100 to 200 years ago.
Sure. I was listening to a recent discussion between Bret Weinstein, the evolutionary biologist, and Tucker Carlson on his show.
I didn't watch it, but I'm aware that it happened.
And
how did that go?
About as well as you might think.
Yeah.
But there was one particularly interesting point that I thought that I would ask you about, is that Bret said, okay, so like we uncovered a complicated watch, and then for a long time people were like, oh man, the complicated watch must have a watchmaker. But now we have, the system that can, make a watch for itself. And that positing God behind this is trying to posit something even more complicated than the most complicated watch. And so even if you still try and say that God is guiding the evolutionary process, you still have a designer that's more complicated than the design, and you've just kicked the design up a chain of being and you even have something more complicated. So why even do that? And but I feel like your book, I kind of can anticipate your answer. It seems like you're saying that God doesn't just explain one thing, it seems to explain multiple things. So I was wondering,
Yeah,
how would you answer that Weinsteinian point?
there's a whole debate that I'm not fully competent to enter into about what we mean when we talk about complexity versus simplicity.
Sure.
Because one of the claims of classical theism, which is, the school of thought that posits a God outside of time and space, and a view that's shared by not just many Christians, but also Jews, Muslims, some Hindu philosophers as well. It's a common view, but part of the view is that, in fact, God is simple. And I'm not going to sit here and try and explain to you what that means because I'm not completely sure what they mean by it. And since they themselves concede that there are attributes of God that we can't understand inherently, maybe they aren't sure either. I would frame it a little bit differently. There are two things in the universe that we have access to: mind and matter. We have access to mind immediately. It is the thing through which we experience the rest of the world. We are aware of mind in this direct way that we can't not be aware of it, seemingly, if we're conscious beings. And then we're aware of matter as it is experienced through our bodies and through their relationship to our minds. So mind and matter both exist. The question is, which is primary? Which comes first, right? And, I think the default assumption of the materialist, right, is that it's just much more natural to assume that matter comes first and that mind is somehow organized through some mysterious process we don't understand as a secondary property of matter, which in the end tends towards the argument that, in fact, mind is some kind of illusion and doesn't have full existence at all. Whereas, this can of delicious flavored seltzer I'm having is the thing that has the more fundamental and coherent existence. I am epiphenomenal. This is the actual phenomenon. I think when we talk about things like evidence for fine-tuning, or when we talk about the hard problem of consciousness and the difficulties of sort of reducing your conscious experience to the cerebellum and tissue and neurons and blood in your brains and so on, what we're talking about is the possibility that, in fact, the default assumption should run the other way, that there is something called mind that, again, we don't know everything about it, but we experience it, we have access to it, we live in it, we inhabit it. It is not a material property as we understand material properties. I should say that the question of what matter actually is actually a very tricky philosophical question too, in ways that I'm also not competent to address. But this is, a point a philosopher friend of mine who's not a religious believer made when we were actually teaching a class together on some of these issues. He said, one weakness in the materialist argument is it assumes that we really know what matter is. We figured that out. And that's not as true as you might think. But setting that aside, I think it's not, since we don't know how to express a description of mind in materialist terms. The whole point is that it seems to have a non-material existence. It seems to me that we can be at least agnostic about what is simpler, right? In the end, to say that, is it, I don't think we need to say, I think in effect, it is already a materialist assumption to say that we know that a mind has to be more complex in some way than, the materials of the cosmos. You're already sort of operating in a materialist frame and saying, well, to make, to set in motion the evolutionary process, the mind that did it has to be composed of more atoms than the evolutionary process. But then you're just imagining God as, all the atoms in the human brain plus an infinite number more. Yeah. And that's not what the assumption that the theist or the non-materialist is making. They're making an assumption that mind is something else entirely, that whether it's simpler or not simpler, like, it's almost a category error, I would say, to say that, like, those are the terms on which you should adjudicate which to choose. Like, if I say to Bret Weinstein, like, which is primary, mind or matter? And he says, well, obviously matter, because it's simpler than mind. Like, I don't think that sentence is actually sort of something that you can clarify and say for certain whether it's true or false, because you are talking about two quite distinct, like, what is simpler, your direct experience apprehending me saying these words, right? Or the process, the physical process whereby sound waves are carried from my mouth through this computer, through the ether, and arrive in your eardrums and then are carried to your brain. Is it clear to us that your apprehension is more complex than that process? I don't think it is. I don't think we know. I mean, I don't even know how we would define that for certain. And again, I'm limited. My philosophical toolkit is more limited than it should be on these questions. But that's my sort of initial response. I mean, Bret, I mean, the Bret Weinstein evolution has been so far to, decide that he believes in almost everything except God. Right. That's been sort of the, so I would expect that he would either have to do a reversal of course at some point, or he may get to, if not theism, at least some eccentric, like panpsychist kind of perspective.
Yeah. So perhaps the God thesis is the most simple and parsimonious of all possible theses.
Well, I think we have some good reasons, again, based on our own experience of the world. Like, again, I'm just sort of speculating here, but say you pick up a book, right? A book is a material object. It's a very complex material object. It's filled with, sort of atoms and molecules and so on, right? And if you could tell a kind of materialist story about where the book came from, that would be insanely complex, right? You'd be like, well, you got these printing presses and you've got, it's just layers of material complexity. You need a forest to produce the pulp. You need all these things to get the ink, right? And that story is true, obviously, but it's also like not correct in the sense that, like, what actually produced the book? What produced Lord of the Rings? The mind of JRR Tolkien. The mind of J.R.R. Tolkien is, to my view, kind of a simpler explanation for the book. And again, this is not a perfect analogy because they're both the explanation, right? Like, the book does have a material explanation, but it's not clear to me that the mind-based mentalist explanation for where Lord of the Rings came from is so much more complex than the explanation of how its materials were put together. And yeah, I mean, generally, like, the case I'm making in the book is not that there is a single slam dunk, this ends the argument forever reason to be religious. It's that there are a set of converging lines of our experience. And we've been talking about sort of scientific evidence. I think the nature of consciousness in its own right and what it is capable of and its relationship to sort of higher realities, its ability to understand them and make sense of them, is also hard for materialism to explain. And then there's the kind of woo-woo, numinous, mystical, supernatural stuff, which I spend more time on than some sort of apologists for a reasonable religion, because I think they are also a big part of, they're certainly a big reason why religion persists under secular conditions, because guess what? People keep having religious and mystical experiences, right? But I think you can get to a kind of materialist explanation for each of those. I don't think they're always good explanations, but there are explanations. But they're like, you need 6 different ones, right? It's like, all right, to explain fine tuning, we got to have an infinite multiverse, near infinite multiverse, and then to explain the mystery of consciousness, we're talking about emergence. We're coming up with these, concepts, or the mind as illusion that don't completely congeal, but we're like, oh, well, we're awaiting a paradigm breakthrough. And then to explain mystical and supernatural experience, you have to impute these incredibly strong powers to the human mind. You have to say, the mind has this Jungian subconscious that's all this complexity. But then you had just been explaining why that mind isn't even real back in the, consciousness part of the argument. And it just is. It's just more parsimonious to say mind probably precedes matter. We're, and some being that one called God called the universe into being, and that's why it seems orderly. That's why our minds seem to relate to the higher order. That's why people have experiences that suggest that higher powers are interested in talking to them. This is the kind of universe you would expect to have if God were real. And there are objections to that. You can say, wouldn't a God have made it easier to travel between the stars? Maybe. We'll find out. I think we might be early in the story of humanity. We don't know. Or maybe we're late. That's also a possibility, right? But that's, you can have that objection. I think a reasonable objection is to say, well, wouldn't God have made it a little easier to be sure about this? Like if the supernatural were 25% more flagrant, people would be more religious. I know, I think that's fair. Like I've been trying in the course of this promoting the book, right? People will often ask you, what do you think is the strongest argument against your case? And initially I would say, well, I don't actually think there are really strong arguments. That's why I wrote this book, right? Like I think the case there, the reasons, there are perfectly sound reasons not to embrace a specific religious tradition. But I think the case for outright atheism is pretty weak in the end. But, you try and see the stronger arguments, right? And like the atheist who says, come on, if there are angels, why don't we have, why don't we have a little more videotape evidence of the supernatural and so on? Like, again, just like 25% more than we have would maybe convert 70% of atheists to Christianity or something. And, that it's true. God has, if God exists, he's decided, I think, to be apparent, but not as apparent as he could be. Right. So there are certainly questions one can have, but yes, I think the case for parsimony, for theism as a parsimonious explanation, is very strong.
So speaking of spiritual experiences and woo-woo and what would happen if we turned that spiritual experience dial up in the fine-tuning of the universe, say 25 extra percent. I feel like your book pairs well with Rod Dreher's recent book, Living in Wonder, which seems to be talking about how woo-woo metaphysical experiences and things like that seem to be increasing, or at least perhaps the permission to talk about that maybe seems to be increasing. Do you think that's increasing? And if it were increasing and more people start having these things or having conversations with friends and credible people who have these things, why should that be a persuasive argument for a skeptic or someone who's sort of on the fence about these questions?
So I'm of two minds about Rod's argument, and he's an old friend. On the one hand, part of me wants to resist it, just in the sense that I do think that sort of there's a kind of myth of secularization out there that makes it sound like the world became really, really disenchanted, and I don't think that's true, right? Like I think disenchantment has always been overstated. We've disenchanted the universities and, Reddit and Wikipedia and these kind of places. But I don't think it's clear that actual ordinary ground level religious experience went way down under modern conditions. And in fact, I think if you start the clock with David Hume around 1800 or so, you could make a case that actually like that was sort of a peak of the non-mystical. Then you start getting the Great Awakenings, you get Pentecostalism, you get like all kinds of weird occult stuff and UFO stuff and so on. Like maybe the modern world, maybe, the 20th century was more enchanted than the late 18th century. Who can say? So that's my resistance. At the same time, I think Rod, in the current moment, Rod is definitely describing something real, which is that something is happening where more people are becoming aware of and open to the sheer weirdness of experiences that are out there. And the question is just how far that goes, right? I think the reason that these things should persuade a skeptic is, first, if you have one of these experiences yourself, you have to fit it into your world picture. And it's easier to fit it into a religious world picture than a skeptical one. Clearly, people do that. They do have what I've sometimes called non-conversion experiences, where they have some wild mystical experience and they're like, wow, that was weird, but I'm just going to sort of put it in a box somewhere and not think about it, right? Like that certainly happens. But at some level, direct experience has to make you raise the odds that God exists, and even indirect experience, right? Like, this is just human nature. The more people you know, the more that religious experience seems like something that happens to weirdos handling snakes in Appalachia, the easier it is to dismiss it. The more that religious experience happens to someone you know and trust, the harder it is to dismiss. And I say this as someone for whom that sort of, I grew up around people having intense religious experiences while not having them myself. My parents were, spent a lot of time in charismatic and Pentecostalist forms of Christianity. I watched people speak in tongues. I watched people get slain in the spirit. And it was all completely credible to me. Like, it was not fake, whatever it was. Maybe it wasn't God, but it sure wasn't like just people, faking it and throwing themselves down on the floor or getting pushed down by an aggressive usher. No, whatever religious experience is, I watched it happen to people very, very close to me. And that, again, even though I'm not myself a mystic, having that happen as a childhood experience definitely just conditioned me to be more open to religious belief. So that's why a sort of uptick in these experiences, or people's willingness to talk about these experiences, is likely to lead to more religious belief. The question is just, how far does it go, right? Like, the professor I know at Yale, Carlos Eire, wrote a book recently called "They Flew" that you may have heard of. That's about stories about levitating monks and nuns and holy people in 16th and 17th century Europe. And the point that Eire makes in that book is that by any normal standard of historical verification, setting aside the fact that they were miracles, right? You would say these events are really well attested to. Lots of witnesses, lots of people writing about them, different witnesses, people who didn't believe in them, seeing them and conceding that it happened, and so on, right? Now, supposing that really happened, right? Supposing that people in this particular period of intense religious ferment, it's the Reformation, it's Catholics and Protestants in this kind of spiritual competition with each other, supposing that was real, right? Like, could it happen again? Could it be that you could have, actually compelling, video on the nightly news or wherever else of a levitating saint? If you think it's possible, which some religious believers would, then you should think it's possible that it could happen now, and that that would certainly change our culture, right? It's possible to imagine living in a culture, most human beings once did, where people don't agree on religion, but they take the supernatural for granted, right? Like, people don't like just accepting the supernatural doesn't mean you accept any particular doctrine. You could imagine a 22nd century America where pretty much everyone is like, yeah, there's probably some angels out there, there's probably some demons, there's probably supernatural realities, and we don't agree on sort of Protestant versus Catholic or even Hindu versus Christian, but we all agree that the supernatural is out there. Probably that's not what's going to happen, but if you take this stuff seriously, you can't completely rule it out.
Although,
which would be a pretty strange future. I concede.
I agree. AI deepfakery puts us in a weird epistemological place with regards to recordings and distributions of the miraculous. That'll be an interesting thing if we start getting more. Yeah.
And you could argue that that we already lived through the only period in world history when a video of a miracle would have just been accepted as proof, and that was like 1967 to 2005, and God in his wisdom decided to limit the miracles then, and so that's it. No one's ever going to agree on anything ever again.
Yeah. Moon landing stuff notwithstanding.
Right. Well, I mean, not everyone. Well, right. Even in the world I'm imagining, where most people believe in miracles, you'd absolutely still have people saying it's all fake. Yes.
Yeah. So you mentioned sort of in sort of your introduction about how there does seem to be a growing tide of religiosity. Justin Brierly talks about sort of a rebirth in the belief of God, and even some survey and demographic statistics start to be backing this up. A lot of churches reported record Sunday attendance on Easter this year, et cetera, et cetera. But when you dive into the statistics even further, it seems especially strong among young people, say Gen Z, or even younger than Gen Z. I'm not sure what they're called. And even especially among young men. And for any anthropologist of religion, one of the truisms is that women tend to be, on average, slightly more religious, slightly more likely to go to church and stuff than men. And so a church attendance rebound driven by young men is a kind of a weird peculiarity
Yep.
in a lot of religious history. So what do you make of that? What
Especially,
do you attribute? Go ahead.
yeah, especially Christian. My
Yeah.
understanding is that the gender gap is a stronger reality in Christian societies than Jewish or Muslim, or I think in Eastern religions. I could be wrong about that, but that when I looked into it, that was my understanding, that it was quite specific to Christianity, that women have tended to be more likely to be practitioners than men. You know, I think that in part, I mean, there's a lot of stories you could tell. In part, it reflects the fact that women have become more successful in our society, and men have lagged a bit when you're talking about like college completion rates and a lot of different indicators like that. And so you have more alienation among younger men than you used to, and that alienation feeds dissatisfaction, which feeds sort of a more intense search for alternatives. That would be one story you could tell. You could tell a kind of negative critical story that certainly some secular liberals would tell, right? Where it's like male resentment of female success is yielding sort of a search for patriarchal forms of religion and so on. I do think that the asceticism of religion is, like, men tend to generalize, very, very task oriented, and modern society is maybe worse at giving men
Mm-hmm.
tasks, and religion does. I think if you wanted to be optimistic about it, you'd say, look, there used to be a gender gap, and the increase in young men going to church is mostly just evening out that gender gap so far, right? It's not like you have huge rates of men going to church and not women, right? It's more that the female advantage has disappeared. And that, if that brings the sexes into better alignment, maybe then church is a crucial vehicle for what is one of the great social tasks of our time, which is figuring out how the heck you can get the sexes to pair off more successfully than they are right now and not become polarized into warring camps. So, yeah, if you took a negative view of it, you would say this is just further evidence of this polarization. The men are becoming bearded trad bros, and women are going to reject them. But I would try and be more optimistic than that, I guess.
Okay, I'll ask you one last question. And since you're a pundit, I feel like I get to ask this. What are your projections and forecasts for religion, Christianity, religiosity for the rest of the 21st century?
I'd say, I mean, all all prophecies are foolish, but I think that there is I don't know if we're going to get an actual revival right now in America, right? It could be that we're going through sort of this pause. You're getting a kind of reconsolidation. Religion is getting stronger in some ways, but over the next 15 or 20 years, you'll still see continued decline. I think that's just totally actual revival is sort of up to God, right? Like, to get the spark that gets you like lots of conversions, that's hard to predict just from sociological indicators. What I would predict from those indicators, though, is that over the next 50 years, there's going to be intense selection pressures in favor of religion that haven't been there in the modern world up till now. All of the kind of social selection pressures of the last couple hundred years have been tended to be anti-religious, right? The advantages and
Mm-hmm.
attractions of secularization in terms of like sort of succeeding in a liberal individualist capitalist society have been pretty strong. And there, not that religion hasn't continued to have some social advantages, but it hasn't had incredibly strong ones. I think in an environment like we're entering into, where you have this individualism has reached a point where, as I was saying earlier, men and women are not successfully pairing off. People are struggling to form communities at all. You have this really strong sense of human obsolescence under the pressures of virtual existence and then probably increasingly AI. In that environment, you're getting first this incredible birth rate crash around the world, where not just like the particular kind of modern society we have in America, but every kind of modern society, it can be East Asian, it can be Middle Eastern, it can be Nordic, whatever, is just really struggling to reproduce itself. And in that environment, the things that religion offers, not just sort of solidarity and community and tasks and all of these things, but just a general philosophical view in favor of human beings, right? In favor of the idea that, the world is good and we're supposed to be here and we're supposed to be doing things. I think that's going to be a really big asset. And I would expect essentially, like I've compared the environment we're heading into to a kind of evolutionary bottleneck, right? And a bottleneck doesn't mean extinction. It means some things go extinct and other things make it through the bottleneck. And I would bet on religion, religious practice, and Christianity to make it through the bottleneck, assuming that, the Terminator Skynet AI doesn't kill us all. But as a religious person, I'm hopeful that that's not how God would want the story to end.
Well, it depends on how you read certain chapters in Revelation, but yes,
Fair point.
Right. Anyway,
the scorpion-tailed, things coming out of the abyss could indeed be
right,
drones
and the seven-headed dragon, or one. There's a lot of elasticity in that interpretation there for various possibilities. So anyway, Ross, I want to thank you for your time today. I really enjoyed your book. I also feel like you're a particularly good person to tell it. I think your mix of having a religious upbringing and specifically exposure to the wooey end of Christianity, but also you're setting in sort of elite East Coast secularism allows you to bridge and speak across that divide in a unique way. And I thought that you did a really good job. So thanks.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for having me on. I'm very grateful, Sam.
All right. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone else, for listening.